The text arrived at 9:17 p.m., while I was elbow-deep in the engine bay of a 2018 Mustang that had been coughing like a chain smoker for 3 weeks. Girls' night with Nessa. Don't wait up. Love you. I stared at the screen, motor oil still dripping from my fingers onto the concrete floor of my garage. Vera hadn't had a girls' night in 2 years. She'd been working late every Thursday for the past 6 months, coming home exhausted and distant, claiming her job at Morrison & Associates was demanding more hours. Human resources management, she called it, managing humans. The irony wasn't lost on me now. My name is Callum Torrin, and I've been fixing cars for 15 years. Started the business after I got out of the Army, back when Vera still thought my calloused hands were charming instead of embarrassing. Back when she'd sit on my workbench and watch me diagnose problems before she decided I was one that needed fixing. I wiped my hands on a shop rag and opened the Find My iPhone app. We'd shared locations years ago during a camping trip when cell service was spotty. She'd forgotten to turn it off, and I'd forgotten to mention I still had access. The little blue dot that represented my wife was moving south on I-94, 43 miles from Nessa's apartment in the opposite direction. Girls' night, huh? I muttered to the empty garage. Guess Nessa moved to the middle of nowhere. I watched the dot for 20 minutes, tracking its progress down the highway. It moved steadily, then slowed, then stopped completely at 11:47 p.m. near a rest area I'd never heard of. The location pin sat there, motionless, for exactly 13 minutes before my phone rang. Mr. Torrin, this is Mercy General Hospital. Your wife has been in an accident. The voice was professional, practiced at delivering bad news to stunned husbands at ungodly hours. I found myself gripping the phone tighter, my other hand still holding the greasy rag. What kind of accident? Single vehicle, sir. She's stable but unconscious. Can you come in? I was already reaching for my keys. I'll be right there. The drive to Mercy General took 45 minutes through empty streets, slick with October rain. I kept thinking about that blue dot, stationary for 13 minutes before disappearing entirely. The hospital was a concrete monument to human misery, all harsh fluorescent lights and the smell of antiseptic fighting a losing battle against despair. The ER nurse was a tired-looking woman in her 50s who'd probably seen everything twice. She looked up from her computer when I approached the desk, my work clothes still smelling like motor oil and betrayal. Callum Torrin, my wife Vera was brought in from a car accident. She typed something, frowned at her screen, then looked back at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Room 314. Are you here for Mr. Heslor as well? The name hit me like a wrench to the gut. Damon Heslor. I knew that name. Vera had mentioned him exactly twice, once as a colleague from a conference, once as someone who'd helped her with a difficult client. Both times she'd looked away when she said his name, a tell I'd filed away without understanding its significance. In that moment, the memory sharpened with cruel clarity. I could see her standing at the kitchen counter, pretending to read an email while casually dropping the name into conversation, as if it carried no weight. I remembered how I'd dismissed the flicker in her eyes, the slight hesitation before she spoke. At the time, it had felt too small to interrogate. Now, it felt enormous. I'm sorry, who? The other passenger, Damon Heslor. He's in surgery, but his emergency contact information was incomplete. Since you're both here for the same incident, I thought perhaps... No, I said, my voice sounding strange and distant. Just my wife. The words came out flat, automatic. I didn't trust myself to say anything else. The nurse nodded, already moving on, unaware that she'd just split my life cleanly in two. The elevator ride to the 3rd floor lasted approximately forever. Each floor announced itself with a soft chime that felt accusatory, as if marking time I could never get back. Room 314 was at the end of a hallway that smelled like industrial-strength hope and broken promises. Through the window, I could see Vera connected to machines that beeped and hummed with electronic concern, Her face was pale, unmarked except for a small bandage on her forehead. She looked peaceful. She looked like a liar. The sight unsettled me more than if she'd looked battered. There was no visible punishment, no outward sign of the damage she'd done, just calm breathing and closed eyes, as if sleep could absolve her. A doctor appeared beside me, clipboard in hand, expression appropriately grave. "Mr. Torrin, I'm Dr. Martinez. Your wife has a severe concussion and some internal bruising, but she's stable. The other passenger took the worst of it. Multiple fractures, internal bleeding. They were lucky." Lucky. The word echoed uselessly in my head. I nodded and thanked him, the motions rote, then asked the question that had been building pressure in my chest since the nurse mentioned Damon's name. "What exactly happened?" "Excessive speed on wet pavement. The vehicle hydroplaned and struck a guardrail. They were traveling approximately 75 miles per hour in a 45 zone. He paused, consulting his notes. There was no evidence of alcohol involvement. No alcohol, just adrenaline maybe. The kind that comes from sneaking around, from stolen moments and secret apartments, and the thrill of destroying someone else's life for entertainment. The kind that convinces you rules don't apply, that consequences are for other people. After the doctor left, I sat beside Vera's bed and watched her breathe. The machines monitored her vital signs with digital precision, reducing my wife to numbers and waveforms. Each beep felt intrusive, too intimate for what I was now beginning to understand. Her purse sat on the bedside table, and I found myself reaching for it before I could think better of the invasion of privacy. Privacy. That was rich. Her wallet contained the usual items: credit cards, driver's license, $47 in cash, and a key card I'd never seen before. No hotel logo, no identifying marks, just a magnetic stripe and the number 247 written in small print on one corner. I turned the card over in my fingers, this small piece of plastic that represented something I couldn't yet name. It felt heavier than it should have, weighted with implications I wasn't ready to process. My mind circled possibilities without landing on any one explanation, instinctively avoiding the truth forming at the edges. My phone buzzed. A text from my sister Maren. "Heard about Vera. Is she okay? Do you need anything?" I stared at the message for a long time before typing back. "She's stable. How did you hear?" The response came quickly. Nessa called me. Said she was worried when Vera didn't show up for their night out. The key card slipped from my fingers and clattered to the floor. I left the hospital at 4 a.m. with more questions than answers and a key card burning a hole in my pocket. The rain had stopped sometime while I was inside, leaving the asphalt slick and reflective, streetlights smeared into long yellow streaks across the road. The air smelled clean in that hollow way it does after a storm, as if the night were pretending nothing ugly had happened. I drove home through empty streets, past closed shops and dark windows, imagining bedrooms filled with steady breathing and unquestioned trust. I wondered how many of those quiet houses hid their own secrets, how many people would wake up believing the same things they'd believed the night before. Our house sat on Maple Street, in what used to be a nice neighborhood before the factory closures and the slow economic strangulation that had turned half the block into rental properties. The lawns were smaller than they used to be, the paint more faded, but it had once felt solid, respectable. Vera always said we'd move somewhere better once her career took off, once she made partner, once the timing was right. There had always been another milestone just out of reach, another reason to wait. The timing was never right. I sat in my truck in the driveway, engine ticking softly as it cooled, staring at the windows of the home we'd shared for 8 years. The porch light was still on, casting everything in the yellow glow of false security. I'd left it on for her, like I always did when she worked late, like I'd done every Thursday for 6 months while she was building a life with someone else. The habit felt almost mocking now, a ritual of care extended to an empty space. The keycard sat on my dashboard, reflecting the streetlight like a tiny mirror. Room 247. Apartment 247. It had to be an apartment. Hotels used different numbering systems. I'd learned that during my army days, staying in temporary housing across 3 continents. Hotels wanted turnover. This was residential. This was permanent. This was home. The realization settled in with a dull certainty that didn't require proof to feel true. My phone rang, startling me out of my calculations. Marin's name appeared on the screen, and I answered without thinking. Callum? I couldn't sleep. How is she really? My sister's voice carried something strained beneath the concern, a tightness I didn't yet have a name for. Marin had always been close to Vera, closer sometimes than I was comfortable with. They shared secrets and shopping trips and long phone conversations that ended abruptly when I entered the room. I told myself it was harmless, that sisters-in-law were allowed their own bond. She's unconscious, concussion, internal bruising. The doctors say she'll recover. Thank goodness. Marin exhaled audibly. I was so worried when Nessa called. She said Vera never made it to her place, that she'd been waiting for hours before she heard about the accident on the police scanner. I closed my eyes and leaned my head back against the seat. Nessa has a police scanner? She works dispatch part-time, remember? Night shift at the county sheriff's office. Marin paused, the silence stretching just long enough to register as intentional. Callum, there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have said a long time ago. My grip tightened on the phone. I didn't interrupt. Part of me already knew whatever was coming wouldn't make the night easier. The confession came in pieces, like a puzzle assembled by someone with shaking hands. Marin had known about Damon for 8 months. Vera had sworn her to secrecy, had painted me as controlling and emotionally distant, had claimed she was planning to leave but needed time to get her finances in order. Marin had believed her. Marin had helped her. She said you'd gotten paranoid, that you were checking her phone and following her. She was scared, Callum. I thought I was protecting her. I sat in my truck and listened to my sister describe a version of me I didn't recognize. Jealous, suspicious, prone to angry outbursts. It was a carefully constructed narrative, designed to justify the unjustifiable. Vera had turned my own family against me, had weaponized their love for her to isolate me completely. Did you ever see any evidence of this behavior, Marin? Did I ever seem controlling to you? The silence stretched long enough for me to hear her breathing change. No, she finally whispered. But she seems so scared, and she's always been honest with me. Always been honest. I almost laughed, but it came out as something closer to a growl. She was in the car with another man, Marin, at midnight, 40 miles from where she said she'd be. I know. Nessa told me about the passenger. Vera must have given him a ride somewhere. Maybe his car broke down. Even now, even with the evidence scattered across 3 counties, my sister was making excuses. The loyalty was admirable and infuriating in equal measure. After I hung up, I sat in the driveway until dawn, watching the neighborhood wake up around me. Mr. Peterson retrieved his newspaper in a bathrobe that had seen better decades. Mrs. Chen walked her ancient beagle around the block with the patience of someone who understood that some things couldn't be rushed. Normal people living normal lives, untouched by the kind of betrayal that rewrites history and makes you question every conversation you've ever had. At 7 a.m., I drove to my shop and opened the garage doors to let in the morning air. The Mustang sat where I'd left it, hood still up, tools scattered across the workbench like evidence of interrupted purpose. I'd been in the middle of replacing the intake manifold when Vera's text arrived. Now the repair seemed like something that had happened to someone else, in a different lifetime, when I still believed my wife loved me. I made coffee and sat in my office, staring at the keycard I'd placed on my desk next to a stack of unpaid invoices. The morning light made everything look different, sharper somehow. The card was from Riverside Gardens, an apartment complex on the east side of town. I knew because I'd done brake work on the property manager's Honda last spring. The decision to drive there wasn't really a decision at all. It was gravity, inevitable and irresistible. I locked up the shop and drove across town to a complex I'd visited once before, when brake pads were the most complicated problem in my life. Riverside Gardens was trying hard to be upscale, with landscaping that cost more than most people's cars and a fountain that served no purpose except to announce that the residents had arrived somewhere better than where they'd started. Building C sat at the back of the complex, away from the street noise and the reality of the world beyond the gates. Apartment 247 was on the second floor, accessible by an outdoor staircase that provided an excellent view of the parking lot. I climbed those stairs with the key card in my hand, my heart hammering against my ribs like it was trying to escape before I could learn what I already knew. The card worked on the first try. The apartment was furnished like a showroom, all clean lines and neutral colors, and the kind of impersonal perfection that money could buy but time couldn't improve. It smelled like vanilla candles and expensive cologne, and the lingering ghost of intimacy between people who weren't married to each other. The refrigerator was stocked with craft beer and organic vegetables, and a bottle of champagne I recognized from our anniversary dinner 2 years ago. The same brand, the same vintage, the same promise of celebration that had never quite materialized in our own home. The bedroom made everything real in a way that statistics and evidence couldn't. The air itself felt different, heavy with the imprint of lives intersecting where mine was never meant to be. It wasn't just that someone else had been here. It was how comfortably they had settled in. The mundane intimacy of the space pressed in on me from every angle, stripping away any remaining abstraction I'd clung to. 2 toothbrushes in the bathroom, women's clothes in the closet, still bearing tags from stores I couldn't afford. A framed photograph on the nightstand showing Vera and Damon at some restaurant I'd never seen, both of them laughing at a joke I'd never heard. I stood there longer than I meant to, letting my eyes linger on details that would have once seemed insignificant. The way her shoes were lined up neatly by the wall, the faint, unfamiliar scent of cologne mixed with her perfume. Evidence not of secrecy, but of routine. I sat on the edge of the bed they'd shared and tried to calculate how long this had been going on. The lease agreement I found in the kitchen drawer was dated 14 months ago, co-signed by Vera Hartwell, her maiden name, the identity she'd maintained in secret while playing house with a man who wasn't me. The drawer had been organized, the document tucked neatly between takeout menus and appliance manuals, as if it belonged there. As if this life had always been planned, always meant to exist alongside mine without ever touching it. 14 months, more than a year of lies, of careful scheduling and elaborate alibis, and the kind of sustained deception that required planning and commitment and a level of cruelty I hadn't known she possessed. It wasn't impulsive, it wasn't reactive, it was deliberate. That realization hurt more than the betrayal itself. The financial records were worse than the emotional ones. Bank statements showed regular transfers from an account I didn't know existed, funded by automatic deposits from her salary. She'd been skimming money from our household budget for over a year, building a nest egg for a future that didn't include me. Every transaction was precise, consistent, almost disciplined. I recognized the pattern immediately, not desperation, but preparation. She hadn't been running away, she'd been relocating. But the real revelation was in her laptop, password protected but not encrypted. I'd set up her computer years ago, back when she still trusted me with her digital life. She'd never changed the admin password. That small oversight felt strangely intimate, a remnant of a trust she'd long since abandoned. My fingers hesitated only briefly before typing it in. The email threads between Vera and Damon read like a manual for destroying a marriage from the inside. She'd documented my every mood, every moment of doubt, every time I'd questioned her increasingly elaborate explanations for her absences. She'd turned my natural concern into evidence of paranoia, had reframed my love as control. The tone was clinical, strategic. I was no longer a husband in her messages. I was a problem to be managed. Keep him doubting himself, she'd written to Damon 6 months ago. Confused men don't investigate. They just blame themselves. I stared at the sentence longer than the rest. Not because it surprised me, but because it explained everything. The hesitation, the guilt, the quiet erosion of my confidence. The strategy had worked perfectly. Every time I'd felt suspicious, I'd talked myself out of it. Every time I'd wanted to ask questions, I'd convinced myself I was being unreasonable. She'd gaslit me so effectively that I'd become complicit in my own deception. Seeing it laid out so plainly stripped away the last of my self-doubt. This hadn't been weakness on my part. It had been design on hers. I spent 3 hours in that apartment, documenting everything with my phone's camera. The lease, the bank statements, the email threads, the photographs of their life together. Evidence of a relationship that had been more real than my marriage for over a year. By the end, my hands were steady, my movements mechanical. There was nothing left to discover, only to preserve. When I finally left, I took nothing except the knowledge that would remake my world. The keycard went back in my pocket, a small piece of plastic that had unlocked more than just a door. It had opened a window into the kind of person my wife really was, and the view was more devastating than any car accident could ever be. The hospital called while I was driving back from the apartment. Vera was awake, asking for me. The nurse's voice carried the kind of careful neutrality that medical professionals use when they're not sure what family dynamics they're walking into. I told them I'd be there soon, then drove to my shop instead. I needed time to think, to process what I'd learned, to decide what came next. The apartment had given me evidence, but evidence without a plan was just pain with documentation. I called Ricky Martinez, who'd served with me in Afghanistan before becoming a forensic accountant. He specialized in divorce cases, following money trails through the kind of financial labyrinths that people built when they thought they were smarter than everyone else. Callum? It's been forever, man. How's married life treating you? The question hit like a slap, but I managed to keep my voice steady. That's actually why I'm calling. I need your help with something. Professional help. I explained the situation in the clinical terms that military training had taught me to use for unpleasant realities. Target acquired, mission parameters defined, collateral damage assessed. Ricky listened without interruption, occasionally making notes I could hear through the phone. Send me everything, he said when I finished. Account numbers, statements, email threads, anything with financial implications. I'll start tracing the money flow and see what else she's been hiding. How long will it take? Give me 48 hours for the preliminary report. If she's been this careful about hiding one account, there are probably others. People who embezzle from their spouses usually have multiple backup plans. Embezzlement. The word felt strange applied to my own marriage, but it was accurate. Vera had systematically stolen money from our joint accounts to fund her affair, had diverted resources meant for our shared future toward a relationship that excluded me entirely. After I hung up with Ricky, I sat in my office and stared at the photographs I'd taken in the apartment. The images were clinical, documentary, but they represented something more personal than evidence. They were proof that my marriage had been a performance, carefully staged for an audience of one. My phone buzzed with a text from Marin. Vera's awake. She's asking for you. The doctors say she's going to be fine. Fine. I wondered what that word meant in the context of a woman who'd just had her secret life exposed by a car accident. Was she fine because her injuries were minor, or fine because she didn't yet know that I'd found her apartment? I drove to the hospital with a folder of printed photographs and a digital recorder I'd bought on the way. If Vera wanted to talk, I was prepared to listen. I was also prepared to document every word. The ICU had been transformed into a regular room, which I took as a good sign for her recovery and a bad sign for my plans. Unconscious wives couldn't lie to you. Conscious ones rarely stopped. Vera was sitting up when I entered, looking pale but alert. She smiled when she saw me, the same smile that had convinced me to propose 8 years ago. It was still beautiful. It was also completely fake. "Callum, thank goodness you're here. I was so scared." I sat in the chair beside her bed and placed the folder on the nightstand, within her line of sight but not obviously threatening. "How are you feeling?" "Confused. The doctor said there was an accident, but I don't remember much. I remember leaving work and then nothing until I woke up here." She reached for my hand. "They said someone else was in the car with me. Do you know who it was?" The performance was flawless. The confusion seemed genuine, the concern authentic, the love in her eyes completely believable. If I hadn't spent the morning in her secret apartment, I might have bought it entirely. "Damon Heslor," I said, watching her face carefully. "He was driving." The micro-expression lasted maybe half a second, a brief tightening around her eyes, a momentary pause in her breathing. Then the mask slipped back into place, confusion replacing calculation. I almost missed it. If I hadn't been watching her so closely, if I hadn't trained myself over the past weeks to notice the smallest inconsistencies, it would have passed as nothing. But that fraction of a second told me everything. It was the look of someone who'd been caught off balance, who hadn't expected the question, and was already scrambling to recover control. "I don't understand. Why would I be in a car with Damon?" "That's what I was hoping you could tell me." She closed her eyes and pressed her fingers to her temples, a gesture I recognized from 8 years of marriage. It was her thinking pose, the expression she wore when she was buying time to construct a plausible explanation. I'd seen it before, when she was late coming home, when plans changed without warning, when a story needed just a bit more polish before delivery. I remember now. Sort of. My car wouldn't start after work, and Damon offered me a ride. He said he was going my direction anyway. She opened her eyes and looked at me with perfect sincerity. "We must have been coming to get you so you could help with my car." Her voice was steady, her tone cooperative, almost relieved. She even tilted her head slightly, the way she always did when she wanted to appear vulnerable instead of defensive. The explanation slid neatly into place, every detail reasonable, every motive benign. The lie was so smooth, so reasonable, so completely believable that I almost admired her skill. She'd constructed an entire narrative in 30 seconds, complete with logical motivations and believable details. Under normal circumstances, it might have worked. "That's interesting," I said, opening the folder and removing the first photograph. "Because according to this lease agreement, you've been living with Damon for 14 months. I placed the image on her bedside table, the apartment lease clearly visible with both their names and signatures. The paper looked ordinary, almost boring, but its impact was immediate. Vera stared at it like it was written in a foreign language, her mouth slightly open, her perfect composure finally cracking. "I don't understand. What is this?" "Apartment 247 at Riverside Gardens. Lease signed under your maiden name. Monthly rent paid from an account you opened without telling me." I added the bank statements to the collection. 14 months of payments, Vera. Over a year of lies." Her gaze flicked between the documents, as if expecting them to rearrange themselves into something less incriminating. The silence stretched, heavy and charged. I could almost hear the calculations happening behind her eyes. Her face went through a series of expressions: confusion, denial, anger, and finally something that might have been relief. The performance was over. The truth was sitting on her bedside table in high-resolution color. "How did you find out?" The question was quiet, stripped of outrage or accusation. She wasn't asking because she felt wronged. She was asking so she could measure how exposed she really was. "Your key card fell out of your purse last night. I went to see what it opened." She nodded slowly, like she was finally understanding the rules of a game she'd been playing without realizing the stakes. There was no apology, no denial now, just assessment. "What else do you know?" I showed her the rest: the email threads, the financial transfers, the photographs of their life together. Each image was another nail in the coffin of our marriage, another piece of evidence that the woman I'd loved had been systematically destroying me for over a year. I laid them out carefully, methodically, the way you present facts when emotion can no longer be trusted. The cryptocurrency transfers were particularly creative, I said, placing the blockchain records on top of the pile. $94,000 from our retirement account, converted to Bitcoin, transferred to Damon's wallet, then cashed out through offshore exchanges. Very sophisticated for someone who claims not to understand technology. Vera stared at the evidence for a long time, her breathing shallow and rapid. The room felt smaller, the air heavier, as if the weight of the truth had physical mass. When she finally looked up, the woman I'd married was gone. In her place was someone I didn't recognize, calculating, cold, completely unrepentant. You went through my private things. Your private things? We're married, Vera. We don't have private things, or at least I thought we didn't. Her jaw tightened, anger finally replacing calculation. You had no right. I had no right? I stood up, the folder of evidence scattered across her bed like playing cards in a game where everyone was cheating. You stole nearly $100,000 from our joint accounts to fund an affair with a man I've never met, and you're talking to me about rights. She pressed the call button for the nurse, a tactical retreat disguised as medical necessity. I need you to leave. I can't handle this stress right now. The doctors said you have a concussion, not amnesia. You remember everything, Vera. You remember every lie, every stolen dollar, every night you came home to me after being with him. The nurse arrived before she could respond, a different woman from the night shift, younger and less experienced with family drama. She looked between us with the kind of nervous energy that suggested she'd rather be anywhere else. Is everything all right here? My husband is upsetting me, Vera said, her voice weak and trembling. I just woke up from a coma, and he's making accusations I don't understand. The performance was back, full strength and perfectly calibrated for maximum sympathy. The nurse looked at me with the expression reserved for men who bully injured women, and I realized I was about to be asked to leave. I'll go, I said, gathering the photographs and documents. But this conversation isn't over. I walked out of the hospital with the evidence of my wife's betrayal and a growing understanding of what needed to happen next. Vera thought she could control the narrative, could play the victim and make me the villain in a story she'd been writing for over a year. She was wrong. Ricky called the next morning with news that made my coffee taste like ashes. He'd found 3 additional accounts, all opened in Vera's maiden name, all funded by systematic transfers from our joint finances. The total theft was closer to $180,000, spread across multiple banks and investment platforms. She's been planning this for at least 2 years, he said, his voice carrying the professional detachment of someone who'd seen this pattern before. The early transfers were small, probably testing to see if you'd notice. When you didn't, she got bolder. 2 years. The number sat heavily in my mind, dense with implication. I let it echo while I tried to reconstruct the timeline, searching for cracks that should have been obvious. I remembered quiet evenings at the kitchen table, calendars spread out between us, her finger circling dates as we talked about starting a family. I remembered open browser tabs with listings for larger houses, conversations about school districts and backyard space. I remembered the Europe trip most clearly, the one we'd been planning since our honeymoon, late-night discussions about Paris versus Rome, about trains and small hotels, and how good it would feel to finally slow down together. At the time, it had all felt earnest. Now it replayed as choreography, a carefully maintained distraction meant to keep me anchored to a future she had already decided I wouldn't be part of. There's something else, Ricky continued. The cryptocurrency transactions were flagged by federal monitoring systems, large cash conversions, offshore transfers, multiple account structures. It looks like money laundering to automated detection systems. His tone had shifted into something more clinical, less about marital damage and more about consequences with teeth. I straightened in my chair without realizing it. What does that mean? It means Damon Heslor is about to have a very bad day. The feds don't care about marital disputes, but they care a lot about financial crimes that cross state lines. I hung up and sat in my office, staring at the wall where I'd hung my discharge certificate and a photograph of Vera from our wedding day. The contrast between them felt obscene, proof of survival beside proof of commitment. In the photograph, she was laughing, head thrown back, completely unself-conscious, and genuinely happy. The light caught her face just right, softening everything. I'd framed that picture because it reminded me of certainty, of belonging. I'd thought I was the reason for that happiness. Now I wondered if she'd already been planning my replacement, smiling through vows she'd never intended to keep. The hospital called at noon. Vera was being discharged, and they needed someone to pick her up. I told them I'd be there, then spent an hour deciding what that conversation would look like. I paced the office, sat down, stood up again. Every possible exchange felt rehearsed before it ever happened, as if the outcome had already been written, and we were both just waiting to read our lines. I arrived to find her dressed in clothes I didn't recognize. Expensive jeans and a sweater that probably cost more than I made in a week. They fit her too well to be hospital issue. She must have had Marin bring them from the apartment, which meant my sister was still actively helping her maintain the deception. The realization settled in quietly, without surprise. "We need to talk," I said, as we walked to my truck. "Yes, we do." Her voice was stronger now, more confident. She'd had time to prepare her strategy. "I know you're angry, and you have every right to be. But there are things you don't understand about our marriage, about how unhappy I've been." I helped her into the passenger seat, my movements automatic, distant. I noticed how she adjusted her seatbelt, how she stared straight ahead instead of looking at me. Unhappy enough to steal nearly $200,000? I never stole anything. That money was mine, too. Money you diverted from our joint accounts to fund a relationship with another man. Money that was supposed to be for our future together. She had no immediate response for that. The engine filled the space between us instead. She was quiet during the drive home, staring out the window at neighborhoods she'd been planning to leave behind, familiar streets stripped of whatever nostalgia they might have once held. When we pulled into our driveway, she finally spoke. "I want a divorce." The words should have hurt, but they felt more like relief. The pretense was over. We could finally stop acting like our marriage was something worth saving. There was a strange lightness in my chest as I said it, like a muscle unclenching after years of tension. No more careful phrasing, no more internal negotiations about tone or timing. The truth sat between us, blunt and unadorned, and for once, neither of us tried to dress it up as something gentler than it was. "Fine," I said, "but you should know that I've documented everything. The accounts, the transfers, the apartment, all of it. And I've frozen our joint assets pending a forensic audit." She stiffened, the first genuine reaction I'd seen since the hospital. Her shoulders squared as if she could physically brace herself against the implications. She turned to look at me for the first time since leaving the hospital. "You can't do that." "I already did. Ricky Martinez is handling the financial investigation. You remember Ricky, forensic accountant, specializes in asset recovery for divorce cases." The name landed hard. I watched recognition register, watched calculation flicker and fail. Ricky wasn't someone you bluffed your way past. The color drained from her face. She knew Ricky's reputation, knew that he was very good at finding money people tried to hide. "This doesn't have to be a war, Callum. You started the war 2 years ago, when you opened the first secret account. I'm just finally fighting back." The silence that followed was thick, resentful. She turned away without another word, the argument abandoned not because she'd lost interest, but because she'd run out of ground to stand on. Inside the house, Vera went straight to our bedroom and began packing. I sat in the living room and listened to her moving around upstairs, opening drawers and closets, taking inventory of a life she'd already abandoned in everything but geography. The sounds were intimate in an unsettling way. Zippers, hangers sliding, the dull thud of items dropped into suitcases. Each noise was a reminder that this had been decided long before today. I was just the last to be informed. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "This is Damon. We need to talk." The screen glowed in my hand as I stared at it, the words feeling unreal despite everything else that had happened. Of course he wanted to talk. People like him always did. I stared at the message for a long time before typing back, "About what?" "About Vera. About what happens next. Meet me at Riverside Gardens tonight at 8. The audacity was breathtaking. The man who'd been sleeping with my wife for over a year wanted to have a conversation about what happens next. I almost laughed, but it came out as something darker, more brittle. "I'll be there," I typed back. If nothing else, I wanted to look him in the eye. Vera came downstairs an hour later with 2 suitcases and a look of grim determination. "I'm staying with Marin until I can find my own place." Her tone suggested logistics, not loss, as if she were discussing a temporary inconvenience rather than the collapse of a marriage. "What about your apartment with Damon?" "That's over. The accident made me realize how stupid I've been, how much I've risked for something that was never going to work." Another lie, smooth and practiced. She wasn't leaving Damon because of some moral awakening. She was leaving him because their secret was out, because the financial crimes were about to bring federal attention, because staying with him was now more dangerous than admitting the affair. "The divorce papers will be filed tomorrow," I said. "You should get a lawyer." She nodded and walked toward the door, then stopped and turned back. "For what it's worth, I never meant for it to happen this way. I never wanted to hurt you." Her eyes searched my face, looking for absolution she hadn't earned. "But you did it anyway. For 2 years you chose to hurt me every single day." She left without responding, and I watched through the window as Marin's car pulled out of our driveway. My sister didn't look at the house, didn't acknowledge my presence behind the curtains. She'd chosen her side in this war, and it wasn't mine. The emptiness she left behind was quiet, almost polite. At 7:45 p.m., I drove to Riverside Gardens for the second time in 2 days. The complex looked different in the evening light, less upscale and more desperate. The fountain was turned off, leaving just a concrete basin filled with stagnant water and the dreams of people who'd thought they were moving up in the world. The parking lot lights flickered unevenly, casting long shadows between rows of cars. The place felt exposed, temporary, exactly the kind of environment secrets came to die. Damon was waiting in the parking lot beside a silver BMW that probably cost more than my house. He was shorter than I'd expected, softer, the kind of man who'd never had to fight for anything in his life. His left arm was in a sling, and he walked with a slight limp, souvenirs from the accident that had exposed everything. He smiled when he saw me, as if this were a business meeting rather than the reckoning he'd earned. "Callum, thanks for coming." I studied his face, looking for some sign of remorse or acknowledgement of what he'd done. I found neither. He looked like a man who'd been inconvenienced by circumstances beyond his control, not someone who'd spent over a year destroying another person's marriage. "What do you want, Damon?" "To explain. To make you understand that this wasn't about hurting you. Vera and I, what we have is real. It's not some casual affair." The words sounded rehearsed, polished to survive scrutiny. "Real enough that you were planning to flee the country yesterday?" His composure slipped slightly. "How did you—" "Federal agents picked you up at the airport. Money laundering charges, multiple jurisdictions. Apparently, love doesn't conquer federal crimes." He ran his good hand through his hair, a gesture that probably worked on boardroom adversaries but looked pathetic in a parking lot conversation with a man whose life he'd helped destroy. That's what I wanted to talk to you about. The financial stuff. It was Vera's idea, all of it. The accounts, the transfers, the cryptocurrency conversions. I just went along with what she suggested. The betrayal was perfect in its completeness. Faced with federal charges, he was throwing Vera under the bus with the same casualness he'd probably used to seduce her. No honor among thieves, no loyalty among adulterers. You're saying my wife masterminded a money laundering operation? I'm saying she's a lot smarter than either of us gave her credit for. She had it all planned out. The accounts, the timing, even the divorce strategy. She was going to claim you were abusive, get a restraining order, take half of everything in the settlement. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. How do you know about the divorce strategy? She showed me the emails she'd been saving, screenshots of arguments, recordings of conversations, a whole file of evidence that would make you look like a controlling husband. She's been building a case against you for months. The parking lot seemed to tilt slightly, reality shifting to accommodate this new information. Vera hadn't just been stealing money and having an affair. She'd been constructing a legal strategy to destroy me completely, to take everything I'd worked for and leave me with nothing but the reputation of an abusive husband. Why are you telling me this? Because I'm not going to prison for her, and because you deserve to know what you're really fighting. Damon walked back to his BMW without another word, leaving me standing in the parking lot with the understanding that my wife wasn't just unfaithful. She was dangerous in ways I was only beginning to comprehend. I drove home through streets that felt foreign, past houses where people were probably having normal marital disagreements about money and children, and whose turn it was to take out the trash. Simple problems with simple solutions, nothing like the psychological warfare I'd been living through without even knowing it. The house felt different when I walked in, emptier, but also cleaner somehow. Vera's presence had been removed, but so had the weight of constant deception. I could breathe more easily without wondering what new lie was being constructed around me. My phone buzzed with a text from Ricky. Federal task force wants to interview you tomorrow. They're treating this as organized financial fraud. Bring everything. I looked around the living room at the remnants of my marriage, photographs on the mantel, furniture we'd bought together, books she'd never read but kept for appearances. All of it felt like evidence now, props in a performance I'd been too naive to recognize. Tomorrow, I would talk to federal agents about my wife's crimes. Tonight, I would plan what came next. Vera thought she was smart enough to destroy me and walk away clean. She was about to learn how wrong she could be. The FBI field office was located in a building that looked like it had been designed by someone who'd never heard of natural light. Agent Sarah Coleman was a woman in her 40s with the kind of direct gaze that made lying seem pointless and dangerous. She reviewed my documents with the methodical attention of someone who'd seen every variation of financial fraud and wasn't impressed by creativity. "Your wife is sophisticated," she said, spreading the bank statements across her desk like a card dealer working a complex hand. Multiple account structures, cryptocurrency conversions, offshore transfers through shell companies. This isn't amateur hour. She works in human resources. I didn't know she understood finance well enough for something like this. She had help. Damon Heslor has a background in international business, specializes in currency arbitrage and tax avoidance strategies. Together, they created a system that might have stayed hidden indefinitely if not for the accident. Agent Coleman showed me transaction records I hadn't seen before, transfers that went back 3 years instead of 2. Vera had been planning her exit strategy since before we'd celebrated our 5th wedding anniversary, since before the vacation to Colorado, where she'd seemed so happy and loving. The total amount is approximately $340,000, Coleman continued, diverted from joint accounts, personal retirement funds, and a home equity line of credit you probably didn't know existed. $340,000, more than twice what Ricky had found, more money than I'd thought we possessed. Vera had been systematically looting our entire financial foundation while discussing our future together over breakfast. What happens now? Mr. Heslor is cooperating fully with our investigation. He's provided extensive documentation about the financial structures, the timeline of transfers, and your wife's role in planning the operation. Coleman paused, studying my face. He's also provided recordings. What kind of recordings? She played a digital file on her computer, and Vera's voice filled the small office with casual cruelty. The conversation was from 6 months ago, based on the timestamp, recorded without my knowledge during what I'd thought was a normal evening at home. He's getting suspicious again, Vera's voice said, asking questions about the credit card statements, wondering why we can't afford the vacation we talked about. Just keep him confused, Damon's voice replied through what sounded like a phone speaker. Make him think he's imagining things. Paranoid men don't investigate. They just blame themselves. I'm getting tired of managing him. The constant performance is exhausting. 6 more months, maybe 8. Then we'll have enough to disappear completely, and he can have the house and the debt and whatever's left of his pathetic business. The recording continued for another 10 minutes, documenting a level of calculated cruelty that made my chest feel hollow. They discussed my habits, my insecurities, my financial situation with the detached analysis of scientists studying an interesting specimen. There are 47 similar recordings, Coleman said when the file ended. Mr. Heslor was apparently documenting everything for insurance purposes. He wanted proof that the financial crimes were your wife's idea. I sat in the federal building and tried to process the magnitude of what I'd been living through. My marriage hadn't just been failing. It had been a carefully orchestrated psychological experiment designed to extract maximum value while maintaining plausible deniability. Will she be arrested? Eventually. We're building a comprehensive case that will include wire fraud, money laundering, identity theft, and conspiracy charges. But these investigations take time, and your wife is smart enough to know that cooperation might reduce her sentence. I left the FBI office with a folder of legal documents and the understanding that my personal disaster had become a federal case. Vera wasn't just going to lose our divorce proceedings, she was going to prison. The drive back to my shop took me past the courthouse where we'd been married 8 years ago. I remembered that day clearly, Vera in a simple white dress, both of us young and optimistic, and completely convinced that love was enough to overcome any obstacle. We'd been wrong about almost everything. My phone rang as I pulled into the shop parking lot. Marin's name on the screen, probably calling to deliver another lecture about forgiveness and understanding and giving Vera a chance to explain herself. She's gone, Marin said without preamble. I came home from work and found a note. She took some clothes and her car and left. No forwarding address, no explanation. What did the note say? That she was sorry for everything, that she needed time to think, that she'd contact me when she figured out what to do next. Marin's voice was shaky, confused. Callum, I think I made a terrible mistake. I think she's been lying to me too. The admission came too late to matter, but I appreciated it anyway. What made you realize that? Marin didn't answer right away. She sat hunched forward on the edge of the chair, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone pale, as if loosening her grip might let something spill out that she wasn't ready to face. When she finally spoke, her voice sounded scraped raw, worn down by hours of realization she hadn't yet processed. I found some things in my guest room after she left. Financial documents, legal papers, recordings on her phone that she forgot to delete. She's been planning to disappear for months, and she was using my house as a staging area. The words landed heavily, each one adding weight to what I already suspected. I watched her eyes flick toward the hallway, as if she half expected Vera to step out at any moment and contradict her. What kind of recordings? Conversations with you. Hours of them, going back over a year, She was documenting everything you said, everything you did, building some kind of case against you. Marin was crying now, the sound of someone who'd discovered they'd been manipulated by an expert. I helped her destroy your marriage, and I didn't even know I was doing it. Her shoulders shook as she covered her face, grief tangled with shame. The crying wasn't loud or dramatic, it was fractured, catching in her throat, the kind that comes when the ground shifts under you and you realize how carefully someone guided your steps. I felt something that might have been sympathy for my sister, who'd been used as thoroughly as I had. Vera was gifted at finding people's weaknesses and exploiting them with surgical precision. Marin's weakness had been her protective instinct. Mine had been love. Where do you think she went? I don't know. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, leaving her skin blotchy and red. But she left something behind. A laptop with financial records and email accounts I've never seen before. I think you should see this. I drove to Marin's house and spent 2 hours reviewing evidence that painted an even darker picture of my wife's activities. The laptop contained correspondence with private investigators, divorce attorneys, and offshore banking specialists. She'd been preparing for every possible outcome, including scenarios where I discovered the affair and fought back. The files were meticulously organized, folders nested within folders, timelines mapped out with cold efficiency. There was no panic in the planning, no hesitation, just contingencies layered on contingencies, as if my response to betrayal were a variable she'd already accounted for. The most disturbing files were labeled insurance. They contained fabricated evidence of domestic abuse, edited audio recordings, staged photographs of bruises, detailed accounts of violent incidents that had never happened. Vera had been building a false narrative that would have destroyed my reputation and guaranteed her a favorable divorce settlement. I felt a hollow pressure behind my eyes as I scrolled through them, the air in the room seeming to thin with every click. This wasn't impulsive self-preservation. It was premeditated character assassination. She was going to claim you beat her, Marin said, staring at a photograph that showed Vera with a black eye I'd never given her. She had makeup tutorials on how to fake injuries, legal research about restraining orders, even contact information for women's shelters. Her voice was flat now, shock replacing tears. She looked at the screen as though it might rearrange itself into something less monstrous if she stared long enough. The systematic nature of the deception was breathtaking. Vera had been constructing an alternate reality where I was a violent husband and she was a brave victim escaping an abusive marriage. If the affair hadn't been exposed by the accident, she might have succeeded in destroying me completely. I need to call Agent Coleman, I said, photographing the laptop screen with my phone. This is evidence of additional crimes. Callum, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I believed her, that I helped her do this to you. I looked at my sister, who was learning the same lesson I'd been forced to accept, that love could be weaponized by people who understood its power and felt no obligation to reciprocate it. She fooled both of us, I said. The difference is that you were trying to help someone you thought was in danger. I was just trying to save a marriage that had been over for years. I left Marin's house with additional evidence and a growing appreciation for how completely Vera had manipulated everyone around her. She wasn't just unfaithful or greedy. She was dangerous in ways that went beyond simple adultery or financial crime. The realization followed me all the way home, settling in my chest with a clarity that left no room for denial. But she'd made one crucial mistake. In her rush to disappear, she'd left behind the evidence of her elaborate deceptions, the fake abuse documentation, the financial records, the recordings. All of it was now in the hands of federal investigators who specialized in unraveling complex criminal conspiracies. Vera thought she was smart enough to disappear without consequences. She was about to discover that running from federal charges was more difficult than manipulating a trusting husband. And I was about to make sure she learned that lesson in the most public way possible. 3 weeks after Vera disappeared, Agent Coleman called with news that felt like vindication wrapped in legal terminology. They'd found her in Portland, living under her maiden name in a hotel that catered to people who paid cash and didn't ask questions. She'd been arrested on federal charges and was fighting extradition back to our state. She's hired an expensive legal team, Coleman said. They're arguing that she was the victim of an abusive marriage and that the financial transfers were legitimate withdrawals from joint accounts. Even with the recordings, the fake abuse evidence? Especially because of those. Her lawyers are claiming that Damon Heslor fabricated the recordings to reduce his own sentence, and that the staged photographs were actually documentation of real abuse that she was afraid to report. The audacity was stunning, but I had to admire the strategy. Vera was using her own fabricated evidence as proof of the very crimes she'd invented, turning her deception into a legal defense that might actually work with the right jury. What do you need from me? Everything you can provide about your marriage, financial records, witness statements, anything that can contradict her abuse claims. We need to build a timeline that shows systematic financial fraud rather than desperate escape from domestic violence. I spent the next week assembling a comprehensive record of our relationship, bank statements showing regular deposits and withdrawals with no evidence of financial control, photographs from social events where Vera looked happy and unafraid, testimony from neighbors, coworkers, and friends who'd never witnessed any signs of abuse. The most powerful evidence came from an unexpected source, Vera's own mother, who called me on a Thursday evening with an offer I hadn't anticipated. I found some things in Vera's old room, Margaret Hartwell said. Journals, letters, financial documents she stored here over the years. I think you should see them. Margaret had been cold to me since the divorce proceedings began, convinced by her daughter's stories about my controlling behavior. But something had changed her perspective, some piece of evidence that had shattered her faith in Vera's version of events. What kind of things? Plans. Detailed plans going back 5 years. She's been planning to leave you since your 3rd anniversary, Callum, and she's been planning to take everything you own. I drove to Margaret's house that evening and found Vera's mother sitting at her kitchen table with a shoebox full of documents that read like a master class in long-term deception. Vera had been keeping detailed records of our financial situation, my work schedule, my emotional state, and my relationship with family and friends. She wrote about you like you were a business problem to be solved, Margaret said, her voice hollow with disappointment. Not a husband she'd fallen out of love with, a target she was systematically destroying. The journals were clinical in their detachment, documenting my weaknesses and insecurities with the precision of a psychological profile. Vera had identified my trust as a vulnerability to be exploited, my love as a weakness to be manipulated, my desire for family harmony as a tool for isolating me from potential allies. She wrote about recruiting Marin to her side, Margaret continued, about how easy it was to convince your sister that you were becoming controlling and paranoid. She called it asset development, turning your own family against you. The most damaging entry was dated 6 months after our wedding, when I'd thought we were still in the honeymoon phase of our marriage. Vera had written about her growing boredom with our relationship and her decision to begin planning an exit strategy that would maximize her financial gain while minimizing legal consequences. I never knew she was capable of this, Margaret said, tears streaming down her face. I raised her to be strong and independent, but I never taught her to be cruel. I photographed every page of the journals, creating a digital record of Vera's long-term planning and systematic deception. The evidence painted a picture of calculated psychological warfare that had been ongoing for most of our marriage. Why are you showing me this? I asked. Because I helped raise you, Callum. You were part of our family for 8 years, and I watched my daughter destroy you piece by piece while pretending to love you. That's not the woman I thought I'd raised. Margaret's testimony became a crucial part of the federal case against Vera. A mother testifying against her own daughter carried weight that no other evidence could match, especially when that testimony included years of documented premeditation. The trial began 4 months later in a federal courthouse, that felt like a temple to justice and bureaucracy in equal measure. Vera appeared in a conservative suit with her hair pulled back, playing the role of a battered woman forced to defend herself against false accusations. Her performance was flawless, vulnerable but strong, frightened but determined to tell her truth. Her lawyers painted me as a controlling husband who'd systematically isolated and abused his wife, driving her to desperate measures to escape a dangerous marriage. They presented the fabricated evidence as real documentation of domestic violence, arguing that Vera had been too afraid to report the abuse through official channels. The strategy might have worked, if not for the journals. Margaret Hartwell's testimony about finding her daughter's detailed plans for financial fraud and psychological manipulation destroyed the abuse narrative completely. No battered woman spent 5 years documenting her husband's weaknesses for future exploitation. The recordings Damon had made were equally damaging. Vera's voice discussing my management and her plans to disappear completely while leaving me with debt and destroyed credit didn't sound like a frightened abuse victim. It sounded like a criminal discussing the systematic destruction of another human being. Damon testified for the prosecution in exchange for a reduced sentence, detailing Vera's role in planning the financial crimes and her manipulation of everyone around her. His testimony was self-serving but corroborated by extensive documentation and digital evidence. The trial lasted 3 weeks. I attended every day, sitting in the gallery and watching my wife perform the role of her lifetime, while federal prosecutors systematically dismantled her carefully constructed lies. She never looked at me directly, but I could feel her awareness of my presence like a weight in the courtroom. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges: wire fraud, money laundering, identity theft, conspiracy, and perjury related to her false abuse claims. Vera's face remained composed as the verdicts were read, but I saw her hands shaking as she gripped the defendant's table. The judge sentenced her to 8 years in federal prison and ordered full restitution of the stolen funds, plus penalties and interest that would ensure she emerged from prison with nothing but debt and a criminal record. Her legal team filed appeals that were systematically rejected over the following months. Damon received 3 years for his cooperation, most of which he served in minimum security facilities that probably resembled expensive boarding schools. He was released after 22 months and disappeared into whatever life people build after destroying someone else's marriage for cryptocurrency profits. I followed the news dispassionately, scanning articles the way you skim weather reports, aware but no longer invested. His face appeared once or twice in follow-up coverage, thinner, more guarded, already learning how to look like someone who'd paid a price. Then even that stopped. There was no closure in his disappearance, only the quiet understanding that consequences were rarely symmetrical, and that justice, when it arrived at all, often did so unevenly. I never spoke to Vera again after her sentencing. She sent letters from prison that I returned unopened, made phone calls that I declined to accept, and had her lawyers contact me about reconciliation possibilities that I ignored completely. Whatever we'd had together had been destroyed too thoroughly for reconstruction. The envelopes sat unopened in my mailbox for weeks at a time before I sent them back, their weight disproportionate to their contents. I recognized her handwriting immediately, the careful loops unchanged, as if consistency in ink might restore something consistency in truth never had. Refusing contact wasn't an act of anger, it was maintenance, like sealing off a room after a fire so the damage couldn't spread. The house on Maple Street sold for enough to pay off the remaining mortgage and provide a down payment on something smaller in a neighborhood where no one knew my story. I kept the auto shop, which thrived once I could focus on work instead of wondering what new lies were being constructed around me. Packing the house felt oddly impersonal, as though I were dismantling a stage set after the final performance. In the new place, the rooms echoed at first, but anonymity brought its own comfort. At the shop, productivity surged. Cars didn't deceive you. They either ran or they didn't. When something failed, The cause could be traced, verified, fixed. Marin and I rebuilt our relationship slowly, both of us scarred by how easily we'd been manipulated, but determined not to let Vera's deceptions destroy what remained of our family. She never forgave herself completely for believing the lies, but I never blamed her for trying to help someone she thought was in danger. We spoke carefully at first, testing conversations the way you test ice, alert for cracks. Over time, shared meals and unremarkable afternoons stitched something functional back together. Trust returned in increments, not blind, not effortless, but real enough to hold weight. Margaret Hartwell and I maintained a cordial relationship based on shared experience and mutual respect. She'd lost a daughter to choices she couldn't understand or forgive, and I'd lost a wife to betrayals I was still processing years later. We were both casualties of Vera's war against truth and decency. Our conversations were restrained, almost formal, but there was an unspoken recognition there. Neither of us tried to justify or soften what had happened. We acknowledged the damage, accepted its permanence, and left the rest unspoken. 5 years after the trial, I received a notification that Vera had been released from federal prison. I felt nothing, no anger, no curiosity, no desire for further contact or explanation. She'd become a stranger who happened to share some unpleasant history with me, nothing more. I deleted the notification and went back to work. The absence of reaction surprised me more than the news itself. Whatever power her name had once carried was gone. I never remarried, though I dated occasionally and maintained friendships with women who understood that trust was something I'd learned to ration carefully. The experience with Vera had taught me that love without honesty was just elaborate performance art, and I'd lost my appetite for theatrical relationships. I preferred clarity now, conversations without subtext, affection without strategy. If something didn't align, I noticed, and I asked. The auto shop became my sanctuary, a place where problems had logical solutions and honesty was rewarded with properly functioning machinery. I found peace in the straightforward nature of mechanical repair, where broken things could be fixed if you understood their design and were willing to do the work. The rhythm of it grounded me. Diagnostics, disassembly, repair, reassembly, cause and effect, no ambiguity. Sometimes, late at night when the shop was quiet and I was working alone on a particularly complex repair, I thought about the man I'd been before I learned what my wife was really doing. He'd been naive and trusting and completely unprepared for the kind of sophisticated cruelty that Vera had brought to their marriage. I could picture him clearly, how easily he'd accepted explanations, how reluctant he'd been to question someone he loved. The memory no longer embarrassed me. I didn't miss him, but I remembered him with something approaching fondness. He'd believed in love and partnership and the possibility that two people could build something lasting together. He'd been wrong about almost everything, but his faith had been genuine. There was value in that, even if it hadn't survived contact with reality. The man I became after Vera was smarter, more cautious, and significantly less willing to accept explanations that didn't match observable evidence. He'd learned to trust his instincts, to investigate inconsistencies, and to document everything important in case it needed to be proven later. The habits stuck. They served me well. He was a better mechanic, a more successful businessman, and a more reliable friend. He was also lonelier, but loneliness was a small price to pay for the peace that came with knowing exactly where you stood with everyone in your life. Predictability had its comforts. The story ended not with dramatic confrontation or tearful reconciliation, but with the quiet satisfaction of justice served and lessons learned. Vera had taught me that people were capable of remarkable cruelty when they thought they could get away with it, and that love could be weaponized by those who understood its power but felt no obligation to reciprocate it. It wasn't a lesson I'd wanted, but it was one I wouldn't forget. She'd also taught me that truth was more durable than deception, that careful documentation could overcome elaborate lies, and that federal prosecutors were very good at unraveling complex criminal conspiracies when provided with sufficient evidence. Facts accumulated. Lies collapsed under their own weight. Most importantly, she'd taught me that survival was possible even after the complete destruction of everything you'd believed about your life and the person you'd chosen to share it with. The process was painful and the recovery was slow, but it was possible to rebuild on a foundation of hard-earned wisdom instead of naive faith. I lived that truth daily, often without thinking about it. I never thanked her for those lessons, but I used them every day in the life I built after she was gone. It was a smaller life in some ways, more cautious and less trusting, but it was entirely mine. And that, I'd learned, was worth more than any marriage built on lies and maintained through systematic deception. The auto shop still operates on Maple Street, in a building that smells like motor oil and honest work. The sign outside reads, Torrin Automotive, reliable repairs, fair prices, no surprises. It's an accurate description of the business and the man who runs it.